Today we bring you a powerful documentary story about a man whose courage shook an empire. A man who refused to bow to colonial masters even when the price was suffering and death. His name is Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the independent Democratic Republic of the Congo. His rise was fast, his leadership was bold, and his end was brutal. Many powerful forces feared his voice because he spoke openly about freedom, dignity, and justice for African people. Today we travel back in time to understand where his story began, how a young boy born in a quiet village grew into a fearless leader who challenged colonial rule. This story is not a myth or folklore. It is a real-life thriller filled with courage, betrayal, struggle, and sacrifice. Stay with us as we begin the journey. The story of Patrice Lumumba begins in the year 1925 in a small village in the Kasai region of what is today known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At that time, the country was not free. It was a colony controlled by the European nation of Belgium. For decades, the land had been ruled under a harsh colonial system that treated the local population as a source of labor and raw materials. Long before Lumumba was born, the Congo had already experienced deep suffering under the rule connected to King Leopold II. Villages were forced to collect rubber and minerals. Many families were broken by violence and fear. Even though conditions had slightly changed by the time Lumumba was born, the system was still deeply unequal. Europeans held power in government, business, and education, while Africans were expected to work and obey. Into this environment, a child was born who would one day challenge that entire system. His full name was Patrice Emery Lumumba. He belonged to the Tetela ethnic group and grew up in a modest family that valued discipline and learning. His father was a farmer and his mother cared for the household. Life in the village was simple. People woke early to work the land, gather food, and care for their families. Children helped their parents and learned the traditions of their community. But young Lumumba showed signs that he was different from many children around him. He was curious about everything. He asked questions about why things were the way they were. He watched visitors carefully and listened to stories from elders with deep attention. His parents soon realized that he had a strong desire to learn. Because of this, they decided to send him to a missionary school run by Christian teachers. Missionary schools were among the few places where African children could receive formal education during colonial times. However, the purpose of these schools was not to train leaders. The colonial system mainly wanted Africans who could read simple instructions and perform basic work. Students were taught discipline, religion, and practical skills that would make them obedient workers. But Lumumba approached education in a different way. Instead of accepting only what he was taught, he began to explore ideas beyond the classroom. He learned the French language with impressive speed and began reading books whenever he had the chance. Teachers noticed that he had an unusual ability to remember information and explain ideas clearly. Some admired his intelligence, while others felt uneasy because he asked questions about fairness and justice. As Lumumba grew into his teenage years, he began to see the sharp contrast between the lives of Europeans and Africans in the Congo. European families lived in comfortable houses with electricity, running water, and medical care. They had access to better schools and opportunities. African families worked hard but had little control over their future. Even simple things such as walking in certain neighborhoods or entering certain buildings could be restricted for Africans. These differences made a deep impression on Lumumba's mind. He did not openly challenge the system at that young age, but he quietly began to form strong opinions about dignity and equality. After finishing his basic education, he searched for work like many young men of his generation. Opportunities were limited, but he eventually found employment as a postal clerk in the city of Stanleyville, which is now known as Kisangani. This job changed his life in ways he could not have imagined. Working at the post office meant that Lumumba handled letters, newspapers, and official documents from many parts of the world. Through these materials, he discovered stories about other countries and political movements. He read about nations that had fought for independence and leaders who challenged colonial rule. These ideas opened a new world in his mind. He began to believe that the Congo could also become a free nation one day. During this period, Lumumba also developed strong skills in communication. He enjoyed writing letters and essays that discussed society and politics. He joined discussion groups where educated Africans shared ideas about the future of their country. Some of these groups were small and informal, but they became important spaces for exchanging thoughts that could not easily be spoken in public. The colonial authorities closely monitored political activity among Africans because they feared any movement that might challenge their control. Despite these risks, Lumumba continued to grow in confidence and influence. People who met him often described him as energetic, thoughtful, and persuasive. He had a natural ability to connect with ordinary workers as well as educated professionals. Yet life was not always smooth for him. At one point, he was accused of misusing funds while working at the post office. The case led to his arrest and imprisonment. Many historians later argued that the punishment was unusually harsh and may have been influenced by suspicion toward his growing reputation. Prison was meant to humiliate him and discourage his ambitions. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Inside the prison walls, Lumumba spent long hours thinking about the future of his country. He read books about history, politics, and freedom movements across Africa and Asia. He studied the writings of leaders who believed that colonized people had the right to govern themselves. These readings strengthened his belief that the Congo deserved independence. When he was eventually released from prison, he returned to society with a clearer vision and stronger determination. He began to speak more openly about the need for unity among Congolese people. At that time, the country contained many ethnic groups and regional identities. Colonial administrators often encouraged divisions because divided communities were easier to control. Lumumba believed the opposite approach was necessary. He believed that only unity could give the Congo the strength to demand independence. As the 1950s approached, the political awareness across Africa continued to grow. Countries in other parts of the continent were already moving toward freedom from colonial rule. Lumumba watched these developments closely. Each new independence movement convinced him that change in the Congo was possible. He spent time meeting workers, traders, teachers, and young intellectuals who shared similar hopes. Slowly, a network of supporters began to form around him. They respected his courage and admired his ability to explain complex political ideas in simple language. Yet even as his influence expanded, he understood that challenging colonial power would come with heavy risks. The Belgian authorities had ruled the Congo for decades and had little interest in losing control of such a resource-rich territory. Anyone who pushed too strongly for independence could face surveillance, arrest, or worse. Lumumba knew this reality but refused to remain silent. His experiences in school, at work, and in prison had convinced him that dignity was worth fighting for. As the chapter of his early life closed, he stood at the edge of a new and dangerous path. The quiet boy from Kasai had become a determined young man ready to challenge one of the most powerful colonial systems in Africa, and soon the world would begin to hear his voice. As the 1950s moved forward, the atmosphere across Africa was changing rapidly. For decades, European empires had controlled large parts of the continent, but the desire for freedom was spreading from one colony to another. Newspapers carried stories about nationalist leaders demanding independence. Workers held secret meetings. Students debated politics late into the night. In the Congo, these conversations were becoming louder with each passing year. Among the voices rising during this time was the determined voice of Patrice Lumumba. The experiences of his youth had shaped him into a man who believed deeply that the Congolese people deserved dignity and control over their own future. After leaving prison, he returned to public life with stronger confidence and a clearer mission. He began working in the beer distribution industry as a sales representative, a job that required him to travel to different towns and communities. This travel gave him the chance to meet many ordinary Congolese citizens. He listened carefully to their concerns. Farmers spoke about heavy taxes and unfair trade conditions. Workers complained about poor wages and harsh supervision. Teachers worried that the education system kept African students from reaching their full potential. Everywhere Lumumba went, he heard the same feeling of frustration mixed with quiet hope. People were beginning to believe that independence might finally be possible. Lumumba was not the only person thinking about political change, but he had a special ability to bring people together. In conversations and meetings, he spoke calmly but firmly about the need for unity. He believed that the Congo could not achieve independence if its many ethnic groups remained divided. Colonial authorities had often encouraged rivalry between communities, believing that a divided population would never unite against colonial rule. Lumumba rejected that strategy completely. He insisted that the future nation must belong to all Congolese people, regardless of tribe or region. His ideas attracted many supporters, especially among educated young Africans who wanted to play a role in shaping their country. During this period, Lumumba joined several cultural and discussion groups where Congolese intellectuals shared political ideas. One such organization was the Association des Évolués, a group of Africans who had received Western education and were considered socially advanced by colonial standards. Members of these groups often discussed reforms and ways to improve African participation in government. Lumumba quickly became one of the most energetic voices in these circles. His speeches were direct and powerful. He did not speak in complicated language. Instead, he explained political ideas in ways that ordinary workers could understand. This skill made him popular far beyond the educated elite. His reputation as a rising political figure continued to grow. In 1958, a turning point arrived. Lumumba decided that discussion alone was not enough. The time had come to create a political organization that could represent the people of the Congo on a national level. That year, he helped establish a new party called the Mouvement National Congolais, often known as the MNC. Unlike many other political movements that were organized around specific ethnic groups, the MNC aimed to unite the entire country. Lumumba and his colleagues believed that a united national movement would give the Congolese people greater strength when negotiating with colonial authorities. The message of the MNC spread quickly through cities and villages. Meetings were held in community halls, markets, and open fields. At these gatherings, Lumumba spoke about the possibility of a free Congo where citizens could choose their own leaders and manage their own resources. His words were not angry or violent, but they carried deep conviction. Many listeners felt that he was speaking directly from their own hearts. They had lived under colonial rule for generations, and now they finally heard someone who believed change was possible. Colonial officials watched these developments with growing concern. The Belgian administration had always assumed that independence in the Congo would come very slowly if it came at all. They believed the country lacked the administrative experience needed to govern itself. But the rise of organized political movements like the MNC suggested that the situation was changing faster than expected. In the capital city, Leopoldville, and other major towns, public discussions about independence became common. Workers' unions, student organizations, and political parties began demanding greater representation. The year 1959 brought even more tension. In January of that year, a political gathering in Leopoldville turned into a large demonstration demanding independence. The protests quickly escalated into violent clashes between civilians and colonial police. Several people were killed and many more were injured. News of the unrest spread across the Congo and shocked the Belgian government. For the first time, it became clear that the colony might face widespread resistance if reforms were delayed. Belgium responded by announcing that it would begin preparing the Congo for independence. Many observers were surprised by how quickly events moved after that. In early 1960, Belgian authorities invited Congolese political leaders to attend a round-table conference in Brussels. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss the political future of the Congo and determine a path toward independence. Lumumba traveled to Brussels as one of the key representatives of the nationalist movement. For many European officials, it was their first opportunity to meet him in person. Some expected a quiet colonial politician who would accept gradual reforms. Instead, they encountered a confident and articulate leader who insisted that independence must come soon and must be genuine. During the conference, Lumumba argued that the Congolese people were ready to govern themselves and that delaying independence would only create more unrest. Negotiations were intense and often tense. Delegates debated the structure of the future government, the timing of elections, and the transfer of authority from Belgian officials to Congolese leaders. Eventually, a decision was reached that surprised many people both in Africa and Europe. Belgium announced that the Congo would become an independent nation on June 30, 1960. The date was only a few months away. The speed of this transition created excitement, but also deep uncertainty. The country had very few trained administrators and only a small number of Congolese officers in the National Army. Many observers wondered whether such a large and complex territory could successfully govern itself so quickly. Despite these concerns, the announcement triggered celebrations across the Congo. For generations, people had dreamed about freedom from colonial rule. Now that dream finally seemed close to reality. Political parties quickly began preparing for national elections that would determine the leadership of the new government. The campaign period was intense. Candidates traveled across the country addressing large crowds and presenting their visions for the future. Lumumba worked tirelessly during this time. He spoke in cities, towns, and remote villages, explaining that independence must bring unity and development. His message resonated strongly with many voters who admired his courage and clarity. When the election results were announced, the movement, National Congolais, emerged as one of the strongest political forces in the country. Lumumba's leadership and popularity made him the natural choice to form the new government. At the same time, another political figure named Joseph Kasavubu became president of the new republic. The arrangement created a balance between different political factions and regions. As the date of independence approached, excitement filled the streets of the Congo. Flags were prepared, celebrations were planned, and people spoke proudly about the birth of a new nation. Yet beneath the excitement, there were also hidden tensions. Foreign companies worried about losing control of valuable minerals. Colonial administrators feared instability. Rival political groups competed for influence within the new government. Lumumba sensed that the path ahead would not be easy. Still, he believed deeply that the Congolese people had the strength to overcome these challenges. The quiet village boy who once read books under the strict rules of missionary schools was now standing at the center of history. In only a few weeks, the Congo would become independent, and he would step into one of the most powerful and dangerous roles in the country. The weeks leading to independence were filled with excitement, uncertainty, and quiet tension. Across the vast land of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, people spoke about freedom as if it were a sunrise approaching after a very long night. Markets were busy with conversations about the future. Teachers spoke to their students about the meaning of independence. Workers gathered in the evenings to discuss what life might become once colonial rule ended. For the first time, many Congolese citizens felt that history was moving in their favor. At the center of this moment stood Patrice Lumumba, the man who had spent years calling for unity and self-rule. After the national elections, his party had gained strong support, and he was chosen to serve as prime minister in the new government. Alongside him stood the newly elected president, Joseph Kasavubu. The partnership between the two leaders represented a balance of political forces, but it also carried the seeds of future conflict because they held different visions about how the country should move forward. In the capital city of Leopoldville, preparations for Independence Day began weeks in advance. Government buildings were decorated with flags. Streets were cleaned and repaired. Musicians practiced songs that celebrated national pride. Delegations from many countries planned to attend the ceremony because the birth of a new African nation was an important international event. Among the most notable visitors would be King Baudouin, the monarch representing the former colonial power of Belgium. The presence of the king symbolized a peaceful transfer of authority, at least on the surface. Yet many Congolese citizens remembered the harsh years of colonial rule and felt that true independence required more than ceremonial speeches. They wanted recognition of the suffering their people had endured for decades. On the morning of June 30, 1960, the atmosphere in Leopoldville was electric. Thousands of people gathered near the government palace where the official ceremony would take place. Some arrived wearing traditional clothing, while others wore Western suits and dresses. Soldiers stood in formation as foreign dignitaries entered the building. Cameras flashed as reporters prepared to document the historic moment. Inside the hall, the program had been carefully planned. The ceremony would include speeches from Belgian representatives and Congolese leaders, followed by the formal transfer of power. When the event began, King Baudouin delivered the first major speech. He spoke about the history of Belgian involvement in the Congo and praised the achievements of the colonial administration. He also honored the legacy connected to King Leopold II, describing him as a visionary who had brought civilization to the region. Many Congolese leaders listened politely, but inside they felt discomfort. Their memories of colonial rule were not stories of generosity. They remembered forced labor, discrimination, and exploitation of the country's vast natural resources. According to the official program, Lumumba was not scheduled to speak. The main Congolese address was supposed to come from President Kasavubu, but as the ceremony continued, Lumumba made a decision that would echo across history. He stood up and asked to speak. The request surprised many officials in the room. Some tried to discourage him, fearing that an unscripted speech might create tension during what was supposed to be a diplomatic celebration. Lumumba ignored these warnings. When he began speaking, his voice carried both calm determination and deep emotion. He started by acknowledging the importance of independence for the Congolese people. But then he spoke about the reality of colonial rule. He reminded the audience that freedom had not been a gift. It had been won through struggle, courage, and sacrifice. He described the humiliation experienced by Africans who had been treated as inferior in their own land. He spoke about workers who had labored under harsh conditions in communities that had been denied basic rights. His words were clear and direct. He did not shout, but every sentence carried weight. Inside the hall, the reaction was immediate. Some European officials were shocked. They had expected polite gratitude, not a reminder of painful history. King Baudouin sat quietly while diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. Yet outside the building, the speech quickly spread among the crowds through word of mouth and radio broadcasts. Many Congolese citizens felt a powerful sense of pride. For the first time, a national leader had spoken openly about their experience under colonial rule while standing beside the representatives of the former empire. Lumumba ended his speech by expressing hope for the future. He called on the people of the Congo to work together to build a nation based on justice and unity. He also reminded foreign countries that the Congo would cooperate with the world, but would not accept domination from any outside power. When he finished, the hall was silent for a moment before the applause slowly began. The independence ceremony then continued according to plan, but the atmosphere had changed. Lumumba's words had made it clear that the new government intended to defend its sovereignty strongly. Outside the palace, celebrations continued late into the night. Music filled the streets. Families danced and sang while children waved the new national flag. For a brief moment, it seemed that the future would be bright. Yet the reality of governing a newly independent nation soon revealed itself to be far more complicated. Only a few days after independence, serious trouble began within the National Army. During colonial rule, the military had been commanded almost entirely by Belgian officers, while African soldiers served under them. Many soldiers believed that independence would immediately bring promotions and better conditions. When these expectations were not met, frustration quickly turned into anger. Mutiny spread through several military camps as soldiers protested against their commanders. The unrest created panic among European residents living in the Congo. Some feared that the situation would turn violent and began leaving the country in large numbers. In response, Belgium sent troops back into Congolese territory, claiming that the soldiers were necessary to protect its citizens. Lumumba and other leaders saw this action as a violation of the country's independence. The presence of foreign troops suggested that Belgium still intended to influence events inside the Congo. As the government struggled to calm the army crisis, another major problem emerged. The mineral-rich province of Katanga announced that it would separate from the rest of the country. The secession was led by Moise Tshomba, a politician who argued that his region could govern itself more effectively. Katanga was extremely valuable because it contained copper, cobalt, and other important minerals that were essential for global industries. Many observers suspected that powerful business interests supported the secession in order to maintain control over these resources. Lumumba immediately declared that the separation of Katanga was illegal and threatened the unity of the Congo. He believed that if one region broke away, others might follow, leading to the collapse of the entire country. However, the government lacked the military strength to confront the crisis directly. The National Army was still dealing with internal unrest, and the presence of Belgian troops complicated the situation further. Faced with these challenges, Lumumba decided to seek international assistance. He appealed to the United Nations for help in restoring order and protecting the Congo's sovereignty. The United Nations responded by sending peacekeeping forces to the country. Their mission was to stabilize the situation and encourage the withdrawal of foreign troops. While this intervention provided some support, it also came with limitations. The peacekeepers were not authorized to participate in offensive military operations against the secessionist government in Katanga. For Lumumba, this restriction was deeply frustrating. He believed that the unity of the Congo was under immediate threat and that stronger action was necessary. Each day, the crisis grew more complicated. Political rivals criticized his decisions. Foreign governments watched the situation closely, worried about the strategic importance of the Congo during the tense years of the Cold War. What had begun as a joyful celebration of independence was rapidly transforming into a dangerous struggle for control of the nation's future. Lumumba found himself standing at the center of a storm that involved internal divisions, foreign interests, and global political rivalries. The choices he would make in the coming weeks would shape not only his own destiny, but also the fate of the entire Congo. The days following the independence celebrations became increasingly tense. The Congo, despite achieving formal independence, was still fragile. The army remained restless. The secession in Katanga threatened the nation's unity, and foreign powers watched every move with suspicion. Patrice Lumumba faced a reality far more complex than he had imagined as a young boy in Kasai. He realized that independence was not merely a ceremony. It was a test of courage, strategy, and resilience. Each decision he made now had immediate consequences for millions of people and for the survival of the new government. Tensions between Lumumba and President Joseph Kasavubu began to surface. Although they had been elected together to balance power, divisions for the country differed sharply. Kasavubu favored cautious negotiation with foreign powers and a gradual approach to internal reforms. Lumumba, on the other hand, believed that firm and immediate action was necessary to defend the country's sovereignty. Their disagreement intensified as Belgian troops remained in parts of the Congo, and Katanga continued to resist reintegration. In September 1960, the conflict reached a breaking point when Kasavubu attempted to dismiss Lumumba from the office of Prime Minister. This act shocked the nation and plunged the government into uncertainty. Lumumba refused to accept the dismissal, arguing that the president did not have the legal authority to remove him. The constitutional crisis created confusion across the country. Different factions claimed loyalty to either Kasavubu or Lumumba. The streets of Leopoldville became tense as rumors of unrest spread. Citizens wondered which side would ultimately prevail. In the midst of this political chaos, a young army officer named Joseph Mobutu stepped forward. Mobutu had observed the infighting among politicians and the growing disorder in the army. Claiming that his goal was to restore order and neutrality, he orchestrated a military takeover. Soldiers loyal to him seized key government buildings and effectively put Lumumba under house arrest. For the first time, the man who had once spoken boldly in front of thousands was confined in his own home, watched by armed guards. His hands were free, but his movements restricted. His supporters outside feared that the army's actions could mark the end of their leader's influence. Lumumba's confinement was meant to break his spirit. The authorities believed that controlling him would prevent any organized resistance. Yet Lumumba remained defiant. Even in isolation, he continued to communicate secretly with trusted allies. He strategized on how to maintain influence and protect the country from disintegration. Rumors spread that he was planning to reach Stanleyville, a city in the eastern Congo, where loyal forces could provide support and possibly reverse the military takeover. He prepared for a clandestine journey, knowing that the risk of capture was extremely high. One night, under cover of darkness, Lumumba and a small group of companions, including family members and trusted associates, managed to escape from house arrest. Their movement through forests and villages was fraught with danger. Soldiers loyal to Mobutu patrolled roads and waterways. Villagers fearful of the army sometimes hesitated to offer shelter or assistance. Every step required careful planning. Despite the peril, Lumumba moved with determination, guided by his belief that he could not allow the country to fall into the hands of those who sought to divide it. However, the escape did not go unnoticed. Mobutu's forces rapidly mobilized and pursued the small group. For days, Lumumba and his companions navigated dense forests and crossed rivers, hiding from patrols while enduring hunger, fatigue, and the constant fear of betrayal. The journey tested their endurance, loyalty, and courage. At one point, Lumumba's group narrowly avoided a patrol while crossing a river at night. They had to swim across silently, dragging children and essential supplies with them. Every movement could determine life or death. Eventually, despite careful planning and caution, Lumumba was captured near the Sankuru River. Soldiers descended on the group quickly, leaving little chance for resistance. Witnesses later described the scene as violent and chaotic. Lumumba was beaten severely upon capture. His companions were also mistreated, but his prominence as a national figure made him the primary target. He was tied up and transported under heavy guard back toward the capital, Leopoldville. For the people of the Congo, news of his capture was devastating. The man who had spoken so boldly about freedom now appeared powerless, displayed to the public as if to signal the end of his political life. Once back in the capital, Lumumba was placed in a secure facility under strict supervision. He was no longer a prime minister with authority. He was a prisoner. Yet even in confinement, his resolve did not waver. He understood that survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on mental strength. He spent hours reflecting on his life, the choices that had led him to this point, and the future of the Congo. Friends and loyalists attempted to negotiate his release or secure his safety, but the political situation was complicated. Mobutu, backed by foreign powers, was determined to prevent Lumumba from regaining influence. Internal divisions combined with external pressures created an environment where Lumumba's survival became increasingly uncertain. The transfer of Lumumba to the province of Katanga was another step in a secretive plan to remove him permanently from the political scene. Katanga's leadership, particularly under Moise Tshombe, had strong opposition to Lumumba's vision of a united Congo. The move to Katanga was cloaked in secrecy. It took place at night, away from public attention, to minimize protests or attempts at rescue. Lumumba, aware of the danger, remained calm and resolute. His understanding of politics, history, and the consequences of defiance prepared him for the final confrontation that awaited. Throughout these events, Lumumba faced a constant tension between fear and courage. He had endured the limits of colonial authority, imprisonment, public humiliation, and betrayal. Yet each experience reinforced his determination to remain true to his principles. He understood that his struggle was larger than personal survival. It was about the dignity, unity, and independence of the Congolese people. Even as the odds stacked against him, he refused to submit to the pressures imposed by political rivals and foreign powers. In the weeks leading to his ultimate transfer, Lumumba remained alert to the movements of his captors. Every interaction with officials and soldiers was calculated. He spoke minimally but observed closely, noting alliances, weaknesses, and opportunities. His intellectual sharpness and courage were as formidable as his previous speeches and political campaigns. Though physically confined, his mind remained free, analyzing strategies and the likely reactions of both local and international actors. By this point, the situation had become clear. Lumumba's enemies intended to remove him from the political stage permanently. His refusal to compromise, his insistence on Congo's sovereignty, and his popularity among the masses had made him a threat to both internal rivals and foreign interests. Despite the danger, he never expressed regret or fear publicly. In private moments, he reflected on the sacrifices required by leadership, the price of defiance, and the responsibility of representing millions who believed in freedom. He knew that his journey from the small village in Kasai to the center of national leadership had brought him to a moment where courage in principle mattered more than life itself. The night that Patrice Lumumba was transferred to Katanga was filled with an almost surreal tension. The air was heavy and silent, the kind of silence that warned of danger lurking in every shadow. Lumumba and his two closest associates were escorted under the cover of darkness, each guarded by armed soldiers who made it clear that escape was not an option. The journey to Katanga was long, and along the way every stop they made was calculated to avoid attention from sympathetic civilians. Lumumba remained alert, carefully observing the faces of the soldiers around him, knowing that even a minor misstep could trigger immediate violence. Katanga, the mineral-rich province, had already declared its secession from the Congo under the leadership of Moise Tshombe. The province's leaders, with support from foreign mining interests and some European advisors, were determined to prevent Lumumba from influencing the region. They feared that if he remained alive and politically active, he could inspire uprisings and push for reunification. When Lumumba arrived, he immediately understood the stakes. The environment was hostile, not just politically, but also physically. The buildings where he was held were isolated and heavily guarded. Each movement he made was watched. Every conversation he had, if permitted at all, was scrutinized. Yet even in captivity, he did not lose his composure. The secessionist authorities believed that intimidation, fear, and isolation would break Lumumba's resolve. They underestimated his inner strength. His days were filled with careful observation and mental preparation. He understood that those who imprisoned him were skilled in manipulation and coercion. Yet despite the fear and uncertainty, he refused to beg or compromise his principles. He maintained an inner clarity that was remarkable given the circumstances. For Lumumba, surrendering his ideals would be a far greater defeat than death itself. As the days turned into weeks, Lumumba endured interrogation and threats. He was forced to sit through long sessions where questions were designed to humiliate and destabilize him. Soldiers struck fear into him, showing weapons, making veiled threats against his family, and emphasizing the power of his captors. But Lumumba remained composed. He understood that giving in to panic or anger would only provide his enemies with the satisfaction of control. He answered when necessary, deflected questions that might betray his allies, and refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the secessionist authorities. His courage became a silent rebellion, a demonstration that even in chains, a man could remain unbroken. In January 1961, the final moments of Lumumba's life approached. The authorities decided that his influence could no longer be contained. A secret plan was put into motion to execute him along with two of his closest associates. The night was dark and quiet, the kind that seemed to stretch time and intensify every heartbeat. Witnesses later described how Lumumba, knowing what awaited him, carried himself with dignity and defiance. He refused to show fear. Even when confronted by soldiers who were clearly prepared to kill, he spoke with calm words, asking only for the truth of their intentions and seeking to understand the world he was leaving. Before the execution, he endured torture designed to weaken him physically and psychologically. His captors sought to extract information about his supporters, his plans, and the network that could oppose the secessionist authorities. Each act of violence was a test of endurance. Yet Lumumba, despite injuries and exhaustion, refused to reveal secrets that could endanger others or compromise his vision for the Congo. He remained a symbol of resistance even when facing the ultimate punishment. Finally, in a remote area of Katanga, Lumumba and his associates were taken to the execution site. The scene was prepared to prevent witnesses from intervening, to ensure that the event would remain secret from the general public. Soldiers aimed their weapons at the prisoners. Lumumba, tied and surrounded, faced the inevitability of death. Even in that final moment, he refused to kneel or plead. His composure reflected a lifetime of resistance against systems designed to humiliate and control him. He faced death as he had faced every challenge, with courage, dignity, and a refusal to submit to masters who demanded obedience at the cost of principle. The execution was carried out by firing squad. Witnesses later described it as swift, a brutal act intended to eliminate a political threat. But the act did not end Lumumba's influence. His death became a symbol of the struggle for independence, dignity, and justice in the Congo and across Africa. In an additional act of cruelty, his body was dissolved in acid to prevent any gravesite from becoming a rallying point for supporters. This attempt to erase his presence physically could not erase the memory of his life, his courage, or the impact of his words. Across the Congo, news of Lumumba's death spread slowly due to the secrecy surrounding the events. Yet wherever the story reached, it ignited outrage, sorrow, and a renewed determination among the people. His life and death became a powerful example of the price of leadership and the cost of defying powerful forces. Even in death, Lumumba continued to teach lessons about courage, principle, and the necessity of unity. Lumumba's story did not end with his execution. It lived in the memories of those who witnessed his speeches, the actions of the people inspired by his ideas, and in the continued struggle for Congolese sovereignty. Historians, scholars, and ordinary citizens studied his life to understand the challenges of leadership, the dangers of betrayal, and the value of resisting oppression. His words, written accounts, and the memory of his speeches became primary sources for understanding the period of the Congo crisis and the complexity of post-colonial Africa. Even today, decades after his death, Patrice Lumumba remains a symbol of African nationalism. Schools, streets, and institutions across the continent bear his name. His life continues to inspire leaders, activists, and citizens who believe in the importance of sovereignty, unity, and human dignity. The lessons from his struggle remind us that freedom is never given easily. It is earned through courage, sacrifice, and the refusal to submit to unjust authority. After the shocking news of Patrice Lumumba's execution, the Congo descended further into political chaos. The secession of Katanga remained a serious threat. The National Army was divided in loyalty, and foreign powers quietly influenced key decisions behind the scenes. Yet even in his absence, Lumumba's ideas continued to shape the struggle for the country's sovereignty. People remembered how he had spoken without fear during independence, how he had challenged colonial masters directly, and how he had refused to compromise his principles even in captivity. His life became a symbol that could not be erased. In Leopoldville, the capital, the political vacuum left by Lumumba's removal created instability. President Joseph Kasavubu attempted to consolidate power, but factions loyal to Lumumba began to resist quietly. Meetings were held in secret houses and safe locations. Former supporters of the Prime Minister debated the next steps. Some wanted to negotiate with Mobutu and the secessionist authorities to regain some control. Others argued for organized resistance to restore national unity. The tension was palpable. Citizens feared violent retaliation, but were inspired by the memory of Lumumba's courage. The Congo had never experienced leadership like his. Outside the political centers, ordinary Congolese faced uncertainty and hardship. Villages were disrupted by army movements, foreign troops, and political unrest. Traders and farmers struggled to continue their livelihoods amid fears of violence. News about Lumumba's death circulated slowly, but when it reached distant towns, it caused shock and outrage. People who had once cheered his speeches now mourned his loss and discussed what it meant for the future. The impact of his life and death reached far beyond the cities. In rural areas, elders told younger generations about Lumumba's bravery and his insistence on unity, planting seeds for a movement that would survive long after the events of 1961. Internationally, governments watched the Congo with growing interest. The Cold War had intensified, and superpowers viewed African nations as strategic territories. Lumumba's outreach to the Soviet Union, in particular, alarmed Western countries who feared the Congo might align with Eastern Bloc powers. His removal and execution were seen as a way to stabilize the country under leadership more favorable to Western interests. Diplomats, intelligence agencies, and multinational companies quietly intervened to support friendly leaders and suppress opposition. Despite these machinations, Lumumba's legend grew. His speeches, letters, and actions were studied by journalists, historians, and activists around the world. He became a cautionary tale of what happens to leaders who refuse to bow to outside pressure, but also a beacon of inspiration for those who demanded freedom and dignity. Back in Katanga, the secessionist government attempted to portray Lumumba's death as a necessary measure for peace and stability. Official statements described him as a troublemaker whose ambitions had endangered national order. However, this narrative did not hold against the reality remembered by the people. Across the country, his defiance in the face of threats became the defining story. Citizens spoke of his unscripted Independence Day speech, of his courage while escaping house arrest, and of the dignity with which he faced torture and death. Even attempts to erase his grave were not enough. Stories and memory became his monuments, carried by those who had lived through the events and those who learned about them later. In the months following his death, Congo's political environment remained unstable. Mobutu consolidated power gradually, using the army and strategic alliances to control the government. Secessionist provinces like Katanga continued to challenge national authority, yet the ideas that Lumumba had championed, national unity, self-governance, and dignity for all citizens, continued to influence debates and activism. Politicians and citizens alike found themselves comparing policies, speeches, and actions to the standards set by the former prime minister. His example became a moral benchmark, a measure of courage and commitment. Meanwhile, across Africa, Lumumba's story inspired other leaders and movements. Young politicians and activists in countries preparing for independence studied his life carefully. They learned both from his successes and from the vulnerabilities that led to his downfall. His insistence on unity among ethnic groups, his refusal to compromise sovereignty, and his bold confrontation with the colonial powers provided lessons for leaders navigating similar struggles. Lumumba's sacrifice emphasized that true leadership sometimes comes with immense personal cost, but can ignite change that outlives the individual. In cultural memory, Lumumba's life began to be commemorated through songs, poems, and public discussions. Writers and artists depicted him as a symbol of defiance and hope. Students studied his speeches in schools, while elders passed down stories of his courage orally in villages and towns, even in places where political control tried to silence his memory. His legend endured. The Congo, though politically turbulent, carried forward the influence of the man who had refused to submit to masters, whose life and death became inseparable from the nation's struggle for dignity. By the end of 1961, it was clear that Lumumba's death had not silenced the movement he represented. Instead, it had galvanized a new generation of leaders and citizens who understood the risks and sacrifices necessary for true independence. The Congo faced immense challenges, from internal divisions to foreign interventions, but the vision of unity and self-determination that Lumumba had articulated remained alive in the hearts and minds of the people. His courage became a model for moral leadership, teaching that even in the darkest circumstances, principle could not be surrendered without consequences to the soul of a nation. Lumumba's story also illustrated the high stakes of leadership in a post-colonial world. His choices, his defiance, and his ultimate sacrifice provided lessons about loyalty, betrayal, courage, and the price of maintaining independence. Students of history, political scientists, and ordinary citizens drew inspiration from his life. Lumumba had shown that one individual, armed with conviction and courage, could challenge empires and awaken the consciousness of an entire nation. Even after his death, his name remained a rallying point, a reminder that freedom, dignity, and justice are worth fighting for, no matter the danger. Chapter 7. As we arrive at the final chapter of the story of Patrice Lumumba, it is important to remember that his life, though tragically short, left an enduring legacy that continues to shape the Democratic Republic of the Congo and inspire the world. After his death in January 1961, the Congo remained politically unstable. Mobutu gradually consolidated power, first as army chief and later as president, navigating the treacherous waters of internal divisions and foreign influence. Katanga remained a source of tension, and the country faced the daunting task of nation-building with limited infrastructure, divided loyalties, and immense pressure from international powers. Despite these challenges, the ideals Lumumba championed did not die with him. His vision of a united Congo, free from foreign domination, continued to resonate among politicians, students, workers, and ordinary citizens. Across the country, communities remembered his courage during independence, his unscripted speech in front of King Baudouin of Belgium, and the sacrifices he made for the cause of freedom. People shared stories about how he had escaped house arrest, endured the pursuit of soldiers, and faced torture without betraying his principles. Even the attempt to erase his grave and hide his body in acid could not erase the memory of a man who had refused to be silenced. In the years following his death, Lumumba became a symbol of resistance and dignity. Across Africa, independence movements referenced his example. Leaders in Ghana, Guinea, Algeria, and other nations studying the challenges of post-colonial governance drew lessons from both his bravery and the dangers he faced. He became a figure whose life illustrated the stakes of leadership in newly independent countries, a reminder that courage and principle often come with a high cost, but are necessary for genuine freedom. In the Congo, the memory of Lumumba was preserved through schools, street names, and public commemorations. Political activists who believed in his vision invoked his name when advocating for national unity, social justice, and economic sovereignty. Even foreign governments, which had once viewed him as a threat, came to acknowledge his significance in shaping modern African political history. His speeches, letters, and recorded conversations were studied by historians, political scientists, and ordinary citizens seeking to understand the complexity of leadership during the Congo crisis. The impact of Lumumba's story goes beyond politics. It is also a lesson about the human capacity for courage in the face of extreme adversity. From his early years in a small village in Kasai, where he showed curiosity and determination in missionary schools designed to train obedient laborers, to his final moments in Katanga, Lumumba's life exemplified resilience. He endured imprisonment, persecution, betrayal, and ultimately death without abandoning his principles. His refusal to bow to masters, whether colonial officials or political rivals, illustrates the moral strength required to challenge unjust systems. Lumumba's legacy continues to inspire new generations. Young leaders and activists study his strategies, speeches, and writings to understand how one person can influence the course of a nation. Communities hold discussions about his life, reflecting on the importance of unity across ethnic and regional divisions. Even in areas where political repression exists, his example serves as a quiet but persistent reminder that courage, integrity, and commitment to justice can never be fully silenced. For those who study history, Lumumba represents both the hope and the tragedy of post-colonial Africa. He demonstrated that independence is not merely the transfer of power, but requires vigilance, unity, and the courage to resist both external and internal pressures. His death also underscores the dangers leaders face when confronting entrenched powers and foreign interests, especially during periods of political instability. Yet his life, speeches, and actions continued to provide a blueprint for moral leadership, showing that standing by principles often requires sacrifice, but can leave a lasting imprint on a nation's identity. As we conclude this documentary story, we reflect on the lessons of Lumumba's life. He reminds us that true leadership demands courage, vision, and integrity. He teaches that the struggle for freedom and dignity is never easy, and that those who refuse to compromise unjustly may face great danger. But it also shows that the impact of principled action can outlive the individual, inspiring generations to continue the fight for justice, unity, and independence. We would like to ask you, our viewers, where you are watching from. Which city and country are you joining us today? Your stories and engagement help us continue sharing untold histories like this. If you have not already, please subscribe to Untold Reality Daily and hit the like button to support the channel. Sharing stories like Patrice Lumumba's ensures that the courage of those who stood for freedom is never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember that history is not just in the past. It is alive in the lessons, struggles, and courage that continue to shape our world today.